Iconic actor Michael Landon was a star popular for his roles on Bonanza, Little House on the Prairie, and Highway to Heaven. However, there was a lot more to his life than most people knew. The final episode of Little House on the Prairie didn't just end a show, it shattered hearts. For nearly a decade, Michael Landon had been the driving force behind it all, shaping every tear, every triumph, and every lesson in Walnut Grove. But while audiences saw the warmth of Charles Les behind the scenes, Landon was fighting battles far deeper than anyone knew. Years later, after his tragic diagnosis and untimely passing, fans would look back on that final episode and wonder, was it really just fiction or his quiet goodbye to the world? The rise of Charles Les. Michael Landon didn't just play Charles Les, he became him. When Little House on the Prairie first aired in 1974, audiences instantly fell in love with the strength and compassion that radiated from his performance. Week after week, Charles Les became a symbol of integrity, hope, and resilience. But what most viewers didn't realize at the time was how much of that came directly from Landon himself. Before Little House, Landon had already made a name for himself as Little Joe Cartwright on Bonanza, one of the most successful westerns in television history. That experience shaped him not only as an actor, but also as a man who understood what audiences wanted to feel. So, when NBC decided to adapt Laura Ingalls Wilder's beloved books, they knew exactly who to call. But Landon wasn't just offered the role of Charles. He was given the creative keys to the entire series, and he used them to create something that would define television for nearly a decade. From the very beginning, Landon approached the show like a mission. He wanted to tell stories about real people, about family, love, and moral choices that mattered. But he didn't rely on flashy effects or grand spectacle. Instead, the heart of the show was always human emotion. As both executive producer and director, Landon shaped everything from the tone of the music to the rhythm of the dialogue. His fingerprints were on every scene, every glance, every tear that fell on that dusty prairie. Over the years, Landon wore more hats than most Hollywood figures ever would. He appeared in 187 episodes as Charles Les, produced 204, and personally wrote or directed many of the most powerful ones, including Remember Me, where he tackled grief and resilience with heartbreaking simplicity. He was famous on set for being disciplined and efficient, often wrapping scenes ahead of schedule and under budget. But even with that efficiency, he never sacrificed emotion. If a moment didn't feel true, it didn't make it to air. By the late 1970s, Little House had become a television landmark, a rare blend of faith, family, and frontier grit that resonated with viewers of all ages. It was nominated for multiple Emmy Awards, and became one of the most beloved family dramas in American history. Yet behind all that success, there was another side to the story filled with creative clashes, hidden frustrations, and difficult choices that tested even Landon's patience. While the show appeared wholesome on screen, not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. Little House on the Prairie didn't shy away from the darker corners of life. Michael Landon believed that if families were going to sit down together each week, the stories needed to reflect both the beauty and the pain of being human. Under his leadership, the show tackled subjects that most family programs of the 70s wouldn't even touch. Death, addiction, maltreatment, and racism, all of it found its way into Walnut Grove. Episodes like May We Make Them Proud explored the unimaginable grief of losing a child, while others confronted illicit substance addiction and social prejudice with raw honesty. Landon had a gift for weaving difficult topics into stories that still felt hopeful. He didn't believe in sugarcoating life, but he always believed in redemption and that even in the worst moments, people could find light again. But that boldness came with its share of backlash. Some critics accused the series of being overly sentimental, while others thought it went too far for a family show. It became one of those rare programs that seemed to anger both sides of the cultural divide, with some calling it too moralistic and others calling it too progressive. In modern retrospectives, critics still debate whether the show was ahead of its time or a product of its era's contradictions. Landon, however, never seemed bothered by the controversy. He always said the show wasn't about politics. It was about people. Even so, there were moments when the show's authenticity was questioned. Historians pointed out that certain storylines stretched the truth of 19th-century life. Educators criticized the show for its romanticized portrayal of the frontier. But Landon's focus wasn't historical precision. It was emotional truth. He once explained that his goal wasn't to make a museum piece, but to tell stories that made viewers feel something, that made families talk to each other after the credits rolled. But as much as Landon inspired loyalty and admiration, he also demanded perfection, and not everyone could keep up. His drive for control and excellence occasionally led to tension on set, particularly with co-star Karen Grassel, who played Caroline Less. Grassel would later open up about pay disputes and creative disagreements that made their working relationship difficult at times. In an interview she confessed, "I felt insulted as his co-star on a hit series. I didn't want to gouge anybody, but I expected a fair wage." She also revealed that Landon once claimed that audiences didn't find her as popular as she thought, leaving her extremely angry. While both deeply respected each other's craft in many ways, their vision for the show sometimes collided. Despite the challenges, Landon's authority was absolute. He was the show's heartbeat. Writing, producing, directing, and acting with an intensity that left little room for rest. He wanted Little House to be more than entertainment. And that drive came at a personal cost. As the seasons went on, the line between Michael Landon, the man, and Charles Less, the character, began to blur. He poured so much of himself into the role that by the end, the two were nearly inseparable. And even as Little House grew into one of the most iconic shows in television history, Landon himself was fighting private battles no one could see. Those personal struggles would eventually lead to one of the most heartbreaking chapters in his life. Shadows behind the fame. Behind his easy smile and signature laugh, Michael Landon's life was shadowed by pain only a few knew about. Long before he became America's favorite father, he grew up in chaos, trying to survive a home that didn't feel safe. His mother, Peggy, struggled deeply with her mental health, and those struggles often erupted in frightening ways. Landon would later recall one harrowing episode that occurred right in front of him. It left a mark that never truly faded. And the trauma shaped everything about him, including his drive to protect, to create stability, and to build worlds where families always found a way to stay together. At school, life wasn't much easier. Landon was bullied and humiliated. He carried a secret that tortured him for years. His struggle with bedwetting, even as a teenager, the shame from it was unbearable. And the ridicule from classmates only deepened his isolation. That experience became the foundation for his semi-autobiographical film, The Loneliest Runner, where he poured out those memories in a way that finally gave them meaning. In the film, a young boy runs to escape his pain, a metaphor for Landon himself, who would spend the rest of his life outrunning the ghosts of his past. When he arrived in Hollywood, he didn't have fame, fortune, or connections. What he had was an almost obsessive determination to prove himself. Early on, he faced a string of rejections, bit parts, and near misses. Casting directors often told him he wasn't quite right. Not tall enough, not rugged enough, not the type. But Landon had something they couldn't measure. Presence. This undeniable charisma finally caught fire when he landed the role of Little Joe Cartwright on Bonanza. Overnight, he became a household name. Yet even in success, that sense of insecurity never left him. It became fuel. The reason he worked longer hours, wrote his own scripts, and controlled every detail of his projects. He wasn't chasing fame. He was trying to build a world where he could never be powerless again. Away from the screen, Landon's personal life was just as complex. He was married 3 times and had 9 children, several of whom followed him into entertainment. Insiders described him as charming and magnetic, but also restless, a man who could be deeply loving one moment and emotionally distant the next. He demanded loyalty, but he also carried a sense of independence that sometimes made emotional closeness difficult. Still, to his family, he was a storyteller, a joker, and a force of nature. The dad who made everything feel possible. Unfortunately, in April 1991, Michael Landon received news that shattered that image of invincibility. After suffering from severe headaches during a vacation, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and unforgiving forms of the disease. It was a diagnosis that stunned both Hollywood and his fans. But to those who knew him best, the shock came with a familiar frustration. His daughter, Leslie Landon Matthews, would later say that her father had always avoided doctors. He was stubborn, convinced he could push through anything with sheer willpower. That mindset had served him well in his career, but this time it worked against him. By the time doctors found the cancer, it had already spread. In the weeks that followed, rumors swirled about what might have caused his illness. Some speculated that years of filming near the Santa Susana nuclear laboratory, a site long associated with radioactive contamination, could have played a role. Others chalked it up to genetics or simple bad luck. Landon himself believed his smoking and drinking, which he had indulged heavily in during the course of his life, may have contributed significantly to the illness. In May of that year, he made one final public appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. It was raw, brave, and unforgettable. Sitting across from Carson, his frame thinner, but his spirit still sharp, Landon spoke openly about his diagnosis. He cracked jokes, smiled often, and even teased the tabloids for their exaggerated headlines. He also pledged to fight the disease with everything he had. What struck everyone watching wasn't his illness. It was his grace. He faced death the same way he'd faced every obstacle in life, with honesty, humor, and a defiance that made you believe he could beat the odds. Unfortunately, just 3 months later, on July 1, 1991, Michael Landon passed away at his home in Malibu, California at the age of 54. His family was by his side, his wife Cindy, his children, and his closest friends. As the man who had given the world so much comfort finally found his own peace, news of his passing sent a wave of grief through Hollywood and across generations of fans who had grown up with Little Joe, Charles Les, and Jonathan Smith from Highway to Heaven. To millions, it felt like losing a family member. But even in death, Landon left behind more than just a legacy of performances. He left behind lessons on perseverance, kindness, and the importance of storytelling that speaks to the heart. And for the cast and crew who had walked beside him for nearly a decade on that little prairie, saying goodbye wasn't easy. Their reactions and the tributes that followed revealed just how deeply Michael Landon had touched every life he encountered. Cast reactions and tributes. When the news of Michael Landon's passing spread, the little house on the prairie family was shaken to its core. To them, Landon hadn't just been a co-star or a producer. He was the foundation of everything they'd built together. For years, he had been the first to arrive on set, the one who set the pace and the mood, the person everyone instinctively turned to when things became difficult. Without him, the world of Walnut Grove suddenly felt emptier, as though its guiding light had gone out. Melissa Gilbert, who had grown up alongside Landon for nearly a decade, felt the loss in a way few could understand. She had entered the show as a child and had been shaped by his guidance throughout her formative years. Landon had been both mentor and protector, steadying her when fame and adolescence collided. His influence ran so deep that for her, losing him was like losing family. At his funeral, she spoke about what he meant to her and how his strength and kindness had defined her understanding of leadership. In a later interview she said, "Michael was the quarterback, right? So, he set the tone of what we were doing. Mine was unique in that I was the only cast member who regularly socialized with him and his family. We all vacationed together during spring break in Hawaii, the same hotel every year. Mike's kids went to the same school I went to. I slept over at their house all the time. They slept over at my house." This statement made it clear to everyone how deep her admiration for Landon ran. For Dean Butler, who portrayed Almanzo Wilder, Landon's death also left a profound mark. He had witnessed firsthand the precision with which Landon worked, the way he could take a simple story and infuse it with layers of meaning. Landon had an instinct for human emotion that few directors possessed. His scripts often mirrored real life, blending struggle with redemption in a way that resonated far beyond the television screen. Butler saw him not just as a creator, but as an artist who had mastered the language of feeling. He once said, "I think people respected Michael, but I don't think that he had that industry respect that he deserved." He captured audiences in this profound way and continues to capture audiences in a changing world. He still is able to capture people because there's truth in what he's writing about. Allison R. Grimm, remembered for bringing Nellie Olson to life, reflected on her complicated but respectful relationship with him. Landon had been demanding, sometimes unyielding, but his perfectionism came from a place of deep care. Even when tension arose, it was impossible not to recognize the sincerity behind his drive. After his passing, she came to see how much emotional weight he carried during those years, and how personal many of the show's themes had been to him. His capacity to channel his own pain into powerful storytelling was in her eyes what made Little House unforgettable. In the years that followed, the cast found ways to honor his memory. They reunited on various occasions, most notably for the Little House 50 podcast, where they shared behind-the-scenes memories and reflected on how profoundly Landon had shaped their lives. What emerged from those conversations wasn't just nostalgia, but a recognition of how rare his influence had been. Everyone who had worked under him, from actors to crew members and producers, spoke about how his work ethic, compassion, and creativity left a lasting imprint. Melissa Gilbert often remarked that Landon's presence could change the entire atmosphere of a set. When he was focused, everyone focused. When he was playful, laughter spread. He had a way of bringing calm to chaos, of reminding people that what they were doing mattered. His leadership wasn't loud or performative. It came from quiet confidence and an unwavering belief in the value of good storytelling. Even decades later, the cast still described him as the emotional anchor of Little House on the Prairie. His influence stretched far beyond the screen, shaping how they approached their work, their relationships, and even their understanding of resilience. His death marked the end of an era. But it also solidified his legend. The people who had known him best continued to carry his lessons forward. And it was that bittersweet awareness of everything he left behind that made the show's final episode so haunting. When Little House on the Prairie came to its end, it felt less like a conclusion and more like a farewell that echoed with the spirit of Michael Landon himself. The emotional goodbye. When the last farewell aired in 1984, it wasn't just another television finale. It was a full-scale emotional event. The series that had defined a generation for nearly a decade was coming to an end in a way no one could have anticipated. For Michael Landon, it wasn't simply the closing of a show. It was the closing of a chapter of his life that had carried both his greatest achievements and his deepest emotional investments. The story of the final episode was a bold and heartbreaking choice. The town of Walnut Grove, a place that had come to represent family, resilience, and community, was suddenly threatened by a land developer who claimed legal ownership of the property. The residents, faced with losing everything they had built, made a drastic decision. Rather than let their beloved town be taken, they would destroy it themselves. It was shocking, almost unthinkable, the ultimate act of defiance and heartbreak.